Okay, hi, I'm Siobhan Algio and I'm the Program Director for the Master of Project Management at Monash University. And welcome to this, our In Conversation With series of webinars with our industry leaders. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nations on whose land we are gathered today. And I'd like to show our respects for their elders past, present and emerging. Today our panel will talk about the strategic areas where we're looking at the fiduciary responsibility of project managers and how that impacts on the community, the client and the project managers themselves. So we're going to hear from Voon, who's the portfolio manager at Oxfam, Ranasinghe from Brimbank City Council, and he is in charge of major projects, and Bajinskis, who's with the Thales group, and he's a program portfolio manager. We're also going to have one of our Monash chief examiners and unit coordinators for consulting projects, Richard Foster, and he'll be helping with the conversation today. So the panel are going to be able to interweave some of the feedback or comments, questions that you might have throughout this 45-minute webinar. So just pop those into the discussion box and we'll view those. If not, during the actual session at the end, we'll bring up some of those comments that we can talk to you about. So I'd like to start this conversation with a definition of what it means to be a profession. And this comes from Bartlett, and when he wrote a book on professional negligence, and I'll quote from that, he talks about where you can demonstrate the application of skill to the performance of a task or the rendering of advice. The skill springs from a body of knowledge accumulated by intellectual effort that is the product of formal training, and the performance of the tasks or the rendering of advice is accompanied by ethical undertakings, usually enunciated by a representative body of practitioners. So we have a representative body here today that will be discussing how this is going to potentially impact on the work that they are doing, and potentially it will resonate with the work that you're doing. So I'm going to start positing a question with Minwa. And given this definition, how do you think we might look at balancing the stakeholder engagement when we're working on a project and the required safeguards to manage the potential for misusing and even abusing the power, and the balance of how we see that generates value for money?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Siobhan, and hello to everyone on the call today. Certainly not straightforward answers to a question like that, and certainly a lot of times has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Within the context of the work that Oxfam does and where I've been involved, working on largely international development projects with the UN and NGOs, it's very clear that we have a very strong responsibility to the community. Community development is there at the heart of what we do. So when we're talking about stakeholders, we have to define it very broadly for our work, maybe compared to other industries. I'd say that, and just for people who may not understand how the international aid work, like world works, I'd say that, usually you have like a NGO like Oxfam, and they're receiving funding from a government or from private individuals to implement a project or a program in a particular community. So in terms of, going to Siobhan's question and how you balance that, because, we do have a value for money policy that we sign with, say, for example, the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. They reckon, and we have certain policies that go with it, which I would say that are hardline areas. So we have certain procurement processes around value for money and anti-corruption processes, and they're the things that are hardline. But then there is scope within this idea of what the value for money, when you're talking about like saving lives or human rights, how do you weigh that up, like of an individual versus a community? So yeah, in terms of how we balance that, we have stakeholder engagement very much embedded through the entire process is what I'd say. So from when we're designing a program, we're engaging with maybe the local government, local leaders, trying to have those conversations with vulnerable communities as well. And we do that throughout. So we're getting that feedback, and all the way we're held accountable to that through our monitoring and finally in our evaluation as well.
And Minwar, just on that, with your work with Oxfam and indeed Oxfam's work around the world, where do the risks that those compromises can emerge come from? Where do they sit within your work, and how do you manage those risks?
Yeah, it's there's a lot of areas for those kind of risks. I'd say in terms of how do we balance that as a profession and as a sector and as individuals, there's certain frameworks and principles that we have, which are global. So there's certain like humanitarian principles that we sign up to as a international sector that are widely agreed to. As a charity, we are, there's certain regulations so there's certain ways that we protocols, I guess, that we sign up to help balance those risks. In terms of where it can come in, for example, and how we balance that out is, like if you look at where it comes in, the risk is how you define a stakeholder is where I'd say that where the risk is, right? So take, for example, the Rohingya refugee camp in Bangladesh, which probably many of you know about. I worked there for about 5 years. And now there's about 800,000 refugees there, and Oxfam's doing big programming there. So do you look at the scale of this, maybe young girl who's who's in part of your beneficiary pool in your project? Are you looking at the broader community of her neighbourhood or of that camp? Or are you also looking at what's the impact on the surrounding Bangladeshi community? Because there's a lot of risk there, right? Because having a big influx of refugees, you're causing like food prices to go up, you're having risks around employment outcomes, all of this for the surrounding community as well. So I'd say that, where those risks are, it's how you balance each of those parts. How do you do that? Again, it's just keeping everyone engaged throughout. Balancing power, as Siobhan pulled out, is a really tough one. We have sitting behind us the rights-based framework that comes from the UN, and so we do that. But it is balancing, But finally, I'd say the main one is do no harm. Like when it comes to that final bit, it's do no harm. And if anything you're going to do, whether directly or indirectly relates to that, then it's
Thanks, Minwar, because particularly when you're looking at value for money and the difference between what you might think are traditional applications of managing projects in extraordinary circumstances or situations like what you've described. And some of the work that I've done with particularly at-risk Indigenous populations in Australia, with various government agencies where do no harm was absolutely paramount. But when we talked about stakeholders, there was a great deal of discussion and debate about who were the stakeholders in that relationship, because they, being the people who worked at the front line with at-risk people, don't often understand the language that we use as project managers. So just in that definition itself, it can be really quite confusing for a lot of people. So if we took that a little bit further, and I'm going to talk to Raj and ask Raj to look at this dilemma that we face when we're talking about potentially the compromisation or the attention that we need to pay to ethics. And when we're delivering projects in community and the value that it has to generate for community, how do we balance that or consider the bottom line profitability against what we might measure as successful outcomes on a project?
I think it depends on the model of the business. If it is an NGO or if it is a local government or government sector broadly, or if it is a private sector, the strategy or the objectives of those organizations differ from each other. If you take a private sector organization where I used to work for Shell and all that, and their motive was to earn, they invest money on projects and they intend to get a decent profit out of it. So the process there is you invest money on a project for a client or whatever, or to bring oil from the ground or whatever, and you spend that money, and you manage that expenditure very carefully, that consumed for the project, and make sure when the project start delivering its benefits, the return on investment is captured, very fast, so that you can earn net profits out of it. But when I moved into local government, it was a total different concept. Because there you tax people. In a local government, it's rates. In state government, they have other sort of taxes likewise. So when you get those tax, you are like a trustee of that money, and your beneficiary is the community. I think this goes same with NGOs as well. So you have to make sure the money that you get from the community, you try to give back most of that as value for money for them, to uplift their quality of life. If you look at local government, whatever you see around you, the facilities, the roads, the parks, the libraries, the leisure centers, everything communal is managed by local government. So we need to make sure that those different groups that needs different requirements. Say, young crowd might need sports facilities, whereas the aged crowd might need a place to have a bingo session or something, a community hub. So there are different pressures. So you need to have a long-term strategy and start delivering those benefits to the community. So there, you are not much focused on creating profit. Rather, you are much focused on providing value for money and uplifting the quality of life for Australians. So there the concepts are quite different. I think that would be the same case for an NGO also. They have different beneficiaries under certain stresses and pressures, and they go in and try to help them out. So then the ethics also behind that is different. Like, now when we do say master plan execution, we do roads, community facilities and all that, the contractor on the other side who is doing that has a different model. He's after profits, and we are trying to get the best outcome for the community. So when dealing with now two different parties, and I am from the client side, it's quite interesting, the dynamics. So we are trying to get value for every dollar that we spend on behalf of the community, and the contract is trying to get much profit out of that dollar that they are getting from. So it's sort of it should be a reasonable balance where we don't make the builder go bankrupt, and we make sure that we give value for money for the community. So it's that balance. And these sort of government sectors have been there for centuries. So we have very good, robust procurement practices and governance practices in general across the board in the industry. So those practices are, monitored as well, like the Auditor General or, risk audits and all that. So it's quite interesting, but two different dynamics, private sector and government sector.
Raj, I need to put this to you, and indeed this is open to any of the panellists to comment on. Is there not a conversation to be had about how we measure profitability in this sort of project work? But if I'd have said to anybody here today, tell me about your corporate social responsibility, and if I'd have said that to you 30 years ago, nobody here would have had any idea what I was talking about. So now that we are in the here and now, and that we are a little more conscious now of varying levels of impact on from our project work, and indeed impact on the general community of what our organisations do as a really wide generality, not just in our projects. Is there not something to be said about how we measure profitability from here that maybe it isn't? And indeed, corporations have been taking that on. As I said, you know, 30 years ago, maybe not so much. Here and now, yeah, CSR is actually functionally measured. So don't we need to revisit this again and say, well, you know, maybe it isn't just about, you know, the yearly financials. Maybe it's how we put a number on those yearly financials that really matters.
Yeah, spot on. Like now, in a typical council, we have a community policy, which is about 20 years in span, and we strategize. We understand what are the requirements of the community through assessments. And based on that, we create a policy for 20 years or something. Then we have a council strategy for about 4 years. That is usually aligned with the councillor time period that they stay in office. And during that 4 years, we plan for a short term, focusing on that 20-year plan. And the council has different areas of operations, more than 200, 300 operations. So say for instance, road network, community facilities, healthcare, maternal healthcare. So those sort of, there are targets that we need to maintain, give now, say for instance, for a certain community area, we need to have certain facilities, a community hub or something. It has been identified in that 20-year plan or the 4-year plan. So then what we do is we go and deliver those. So for each of those projects, you have a robust business case. And in that business case, it's well defined why the project was created, based on what statistics, and what are the benefits that it is supposed to deliver. Say for instance, if we do a community hub and if we say, okay, we are going to cater 100 community groups, and that is going to give benefit to 10,000, community participants. So we have that statistic with us. So when we do the design and the budget and everything, is looking at that particular requirement. So so as you said, the profitability in a government setting is the actual benefits that the project delivered, the KPIs that it was originally based on in the business case level. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So, sorry, Siobhan, I'm just going to stretch this just a little further.
No, this is good, because I'd like to see it compared across the other sectors too, yeah.
I was about to say, Ray, I'm going to give you some forewarning because I'm going to point to you in just a second. But Raj, the strategic plans and the annual planning that you're talking about is required under the Local Government Act. And before that was introduced in 1989, though, I didn't see, and I think most would agree, I didn't see a lot of forward planning happen on a local government level. Now, local governments were dragged, in the late 80s, early 90s, kicking and screaming into this, into the requirements of the new Act. And now, well, it's just the way it's done. And local governments now, thankfully, don't actually know much different because, the Act's been around for a while and because it's all in a bit of a groove now. But Ray, what about industry? Industry doesn't come under the Local Government Act and doesn't have those actual requirements. Yet there is a lot of forward planning going on in industry too. So perhaps if we could adapt now the same question to you, what would you say now about that need for considering profitability and how you measure profitability?
Sure. Very good and broad sets of questions here. I mean, certainly from a corporate perspective, we have shareholders, and profit, is to the shareholder front and centre to their investments that they make in our business. And the measurements that we put in place for project success, as you've mentioned already, are often measured around our financial indicators and financial means. And certainly as we deliver programs and our value propositions, key to each measure that we take, often on a monthly basis, is very much around margin, and about maintaining margin and in fact improving margin. And of course, in the corporate sector, there's a whole range of KPIs that are put in place to be able to ensure that throughout that delivery, that position is maintained. But certainly more broadly, beyond that too, I think what is also absolutely key now to any business is the value they bring more broadly, and the values within which they operate. And customer trust for us is absolutely front and centre. And so whilst when we were awarded the particular project, it was done so against a very fixed set of requirements and the compliance against that requirement set. And we were engaged on those terms, often as with it as well, of course, schedule and other measures. But beyond that as well, it's also those fringe types of areas of value that you can bring through the ownership of risk. Okay, and that by extending your value proposition to perhaps look into other areas of the community, the customer themselves, understand what risks they are trying to work through, what additional support that you can bring to that, brings reward, both, to be clear, in the financial context, but also from like a reputational perspective as well. So, but certainly, to that point in the corporate sector, performance and success is measured in a binary fashion. But it is not, my point is, it is not the only, performance indicator today. There are others as well.
Yeah, and Richard, I'm going to jump in now and ask Ray to continue, because you mentioned the word trust. And we've talked about that previously when you were talking about how important it is to look at the value and the behaviours when you're working both in a domestic and an international market, to building trusting relationships when you're trying to deliver projects with this binary measure against schedule, as you said, or looking at risk in a context of, again, under the umbrella of what is a project manager's fiduciary responsibility in this space to still achieve all of the scope and meet objectives.
Yeah, look, it's a very good point. And to be clear for the audience as well, we deliver programs around the world. So we operate, in every area, defence and aerospace, from satellites into military as well. And of course, through those engagements, the maturity and governance that exists within those contracts varies quite significantly. Certainly, in Australia and even in places like Singapore as well, the level of contractual compliance and engagement and oversight is very, very high, and therefore the measures again in those types of engagements is again typically a binary one centered around compliance. But certainly in some of those other areas where we work, that is often balanced off by the customer's team and the risks that they themselves are trying to manage more closely. And sometimes these risks even extend to personal risk in making decisions. And in those sorts of instances, then that trust becomes absolutely key and cornerstone to being able to successfully deliver the project. And that relationship, and the investment into building those relationships with the stakeholders on the customer side becomes one of the primary ways of being able to move forward. And in some cultures, that personal and reputational risk to that person is a hot button that keeps them up at night throughout the process, because quite often the projects that we're seeking to deliver, particularly in our space, are complex. They're complex, they're difficult, they're challenging. They are not, a standard type of, delivery. And as a consequence, the team that are engaged are challenged as such. And so you do need to often, factor that in and then consider the program looking through their lens and understanding, what motivates them. And as a general rule, like I've often said, is what is important to them is important to you. And therefore you need to take the time to understand that. At the same time too, meeting your responsibility in a corporate setting to maintain margin, but a balance is to be found. And often you get put into a difficult position as a program manager to often, balance these often, stretching of compliance requirements to that delivery position.
Yeah, thanks, Ray, because sometimes it can also, as a project manager or directing a program of work, it comes back to you as the leader. And the saying about a fish rots from the head down. If we don't exhibit the appropriate behaviours, develop those trusting relationships and balance the needs for appropriate outcomes, whatever the context is, and it will change, as you mentioned, whether you're maybe working on a project in an international arena or domestically. We need to be very cognizant of what those requirements are. I'm going to step into a space where, Richard, you've got a lot of experience in this, and bring in what Minwa, you mentioned front up about how you have an ethos of do no harm. And Richard, when we're talking about the aspects of a profession, and I'm going to quote John Twyford here, where he was a lawyer and talked about how you have to hold the interests of his or her client paramount. So how would you define and this is for Richard and for the panel, and even anybody who's listening, because we'll bring questions in at the end, how would you define a project manager's fiduciary responsibility? And who are they ultimately responsible to in all of these contexts? And we've seen and heard from very different environments or arenas that project managers will be required to do this.
It's a damn good question. In some ways, though, it's, excuse me, in some ways it's a bit of a wicked question too, because the answer to it is going to vary across the participants that we've even got here on the panel today. So what I can give you is this, maybe if I break it down to a sort of a baseline level, and if we start by saying, well, there is in fact, there's a number, but they generally correlate into one thing. There's a number of legal definitions around fiduciary responsibility. And again, they do tend to all come down to the same thing. Now, how they're applied, that's a far more open question. But the first thing I think we need to understand is the legal definition, the way I like to see it anyway, is that is very, very much your baseline. That is your baseline effort. It's not so much where I think we should be aiming. It's actually our starting point. We need to meet a legal definition, and then by and large, I think we need to exceed it. Because frankly, the legal definition doesn't give you all that much. It just gives you that starting point. And if you did start there and stop there at the same time, I frankly think we can all do a hell of a lot better than that. So if the Corporations Act has a definition, I'm not going to go into that sort of stuff, but that will apply to most people working on projects in Australia. It will also, though, again, as a starting point, I think we need to lead on from that. Above fiduciary responsibilities, and to just put a frame around fiduciary responsibility, maybe if we just accept that by and large, generally, and I emphasise generally, what that means is that you have a responsibility. Your first responsibility is actually to somebody else. It is not to you. So that may be your client. It may be your employer. It may be a party to a contract. So again, it doesn't just apply in corporations law. It applies across contract. It applies across most commercial relationships in general. So it simply means, in very short terms, that your responsibility, your duty is to somebody else. You'll then have other layers. You then may have duties of care. You may have duties of responsibility that take you up another ladder or series of steps. There's probably, this is actually quoted quite a lot, so I'm not going to hesitate in quoting it again. There's basically two things you don't want to be doing if you are actually exercising your fiduciary responsibility. Two very basic things, and if you remember these two things, you'll probably be okay in most terms. And that is, firstly, don't use your own position for any sort of personal gain. Okay, again, to do so would be immediately compromising that fiduciary responsibility that you have to somebody else. If you are acting to advance your own personal gain, you have immediately breached that. So that's the first thing. Don't act for yourself. The second, or in your own interests, only in somebody else's. The second is, don't be in a position of conflict. Don't place yourself in a conflicted state. If you remember those two things, you're probably in most cases going to meet your fiduciary responsibility. But again, that is only the legal starting point. Now, what else do we want to do to actually advance? A bit like what Ray was saying, actually, I appreciated a lot of that, because it is very easy a lot of the time for industry simply to focus on the bottom line without seeing outside that very minimalist square and seeing how that bottom line can be influenced by things more broadly, like your reputation. Now, how does your reputation stand up if you did compromise one of those two basic points of fiduciary responsibility? Perhaps you even got away with it initially, so it didn't affect the actual delivery of that project, but it may hinder you down the line when the word gets out that you're actually not all that reliable, that you did actually undercut somebody to whom you had a fiduciary responsibility, and now nobody wants you to do project work for them anymore. That can be a bit of an issue to your bottom line, one might imagine. And this is exactly the sort of thing where I think industry codes and even professional codes of conduct have picked up on this quite a bit. So you have a tighter ethical overlay that might have a fiduciary underpinning, but isn't then restricted to that. It will go to things in more detail, like, you know, the restrictions around conflict and that sort of thing. We're used to this sort of conversation in terms of doctors, lawyers, accountants, you know, these sort of professions that do have well-established industry codes of practice and professional codes of practice and codes of conduct, indeed disciplinary panels for their own industries that other industries are still sort of catching up to, that have been around for quite a while. Again, look, with varying degrees of success, but the point is they have been there. Again, coming from a legal underpinning, but advancing upon it. So I think the real conversation now is about, and perhaps for our panellists more generally now, is there an example you can think of where your work or your management of a project could face a conflict, or perhaps indeed, if you've got an example, has faced a conflict and how you dealt with that, or where there has been, and we all know there has been examples in the media over the years about how people have been persuaded by advancing their own personal gain, albeit illegally at times, where that ought not have happened. And there are times that we just don't hear about as well. So please don't mention any names or anything, but if there are examples of this sort of thing, I think it'd be great to cite them, or even just situations you can think of where conflicts and challenges to your fiduciary responsibility do arise. Don't all speak at once.
Yeah, that's a bit of a, I'm happy to have a first go at it, figure out the difficult situations. Yeah, I guess, I think, yeah, that's, I don't know, just hearing the speakers so far, there's so many things that are popping to mind. Like for project managers, I think as well, yes, there's fiduciary responsibility to your employer, but I would encourage project managers, or professionals anyway, you have to really know, there's the importance of whistleblowing, right? As an example, like you need to be able to know when you as an individual professional maybe disagree with what your employer is doing or how they're doing it. So that is certainly maybe an area of tension for sure. And, you know, the aid world is not immune to, you know, instances of corruption and abuse. So that can be a place where there is that kind of conflict. The other place that I would say is with aid organisations, and some do this more than others, but sometimes they either can't accept a contract that's being offered by a government, or they terminate it or escalate it to say, actually, we've started to disagree with the direction of where this is going. And so before you get to that point of termination, you know, you escalate it, talk about where you're feeling the conflicts. But yeah, there's been cases of, like, one example is in Afghanistan, and not naming any names, but you know, there was governments looking to offer big contracts to NGOs to do work, which brought them into conflict with their values as humanitarian organisations. Some organisations just chose to either pull out or not take that money at all. Others did take it, and so they're not looked well upon in the sector. So they're probably the kind of areas where there's those kind of tensions.
Raj, with the work that you're doing in Brimbank and comparing that to the work that you did with the petrochemical companies, how would you see this causing a potential issue from some of your experiences?
At Shell I was in renewable energy. So so my the way I look at this is like corruption, or not getting the results that you expect from a project manager could occur in several ways. One is that having favorizations to certain parties, or in another way, not getting what is supposed to be got from the value, the money that you spend. So letting the contractor do a short job instead of the full job. Not letting them keep up to the mark that you expect. So in my career, I have been quite sort of lucky. The way that I manage projects is from the very beginning, I set the precedence of no nonsense attitude, where I talk about the KPIs and I talk them about how I am going to monitor, have the proper registers, variation registers, RFIs, requests for information registers, extension of time registers. So I hold them to those minutes that we have in meetings. My feeling is that if you are a dedicated project manager, you need to stick to a consistent approach and set a precedence at the very beginning of a relationship with a contractor or a design consultant of what you are exactly expecting and how we are going to measure them. And if you hit that nail on the head at the very beginning and set that precedence, I think there is less chance for these sort of misappropriations to happen, because then they understand exactly where this guy is coming from, and that non-nonsense attitude gives a good outcome, and that sort of creates a very good working relationship as well, because when they understand where you are coming from, when they have an issue also, they come to you genuinely and say, look, we have this issue, how can we work through this issue? Then we go back to the designer, we discuss with them and try to tackle the situation. So that sort of good relationship, I think it's all about precedence. Project managers need to have a good set of rules in managing projects. And you need to set the rules of the game at the beginning of the game, not midway of the game, so that everybody is clear how the game is played. So that's that has been one of my golden principles in my career now. It's over 20 years or so, and it had helped me a lot in all the projects I have done. So I think that should be a way to overcome situation like this.
Vaughn's about to kick my butt because we're really up against time,
We're
but I
up
can't
against
let you
the
go,
time.
Raj. Can I just get 20 seconds on this from you? Because you are in the local government sector, there are 3 councils in Victoria at the moment that have all been sacked. Yeah. And 2 of them were sacked directly in relation to conflicts and basically, you know, different versions or types of allegedly corrupt conduct. Yeah. So I hasten to point out, none of them were your council, Raj, so you're off the hook. And I'm not surprised either. However, give us 20 seconds on this. Is this a problem that is difficult and a particular challenge for the local government sector?
It is a challenging thing because time to time you hear of these things and you hear that administrators come over and take over the council and manage it. So when I came to the current council also, they had a setup like that and it worked really well. It worked like a private sector setup sort of because, you know, those people are not politically involved. But in, time to time you come across these sort of situations, but the fact that this has come up and these 2-3 councils that has been highlighted means the system is working. It is being picked up and it is being corrected because to my knowledge there are over 500, close to 550 local governments in Australia. That's a huge number. So when you consider, 2 or 3 out of that huge sample or a universe, it's a reasonable thing. If you really look at, private sector, it could be far, comparatively, local government could be better. I'm not sure, yeah. So the fact that these have been picked up. And it's been addressed is a factor that the systems and the processes are in place. And that means there are ways to raise grievances and those are being attended to and being audited. So I think overall local government does a good job because since I came from private sector, I appreciate a lot what local government do because I'm an engineer by myself. So I used to earn a lot of money for business tycoons or shareholders. Now, the satisfaction that I get now from a facility that I built being used by, aged people or young generation at a sports pavilion or a reserve or a master plan, it gives me immense pressure as a professional as well. Those are not countable by the dollars that they pay me to do my job. So I think the benefit that the sector gives is far outweighs the minor issues that you come across, once in a while. Yeah.
Thanks, Raj. We're going to have to wind it up because we're a little bit over. We could talk, I think, for at least another hour, but I don't know that our participants will be able to stay that long. We will be recording, distributing the recording through the public arenas over the next week or so. So thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists for giving their time to be able to discuss this fairly crucial topic around how we manage our fiduciary responsibility. So Minwar, Ray, Raj and Richard, thank you. And to the participants for joining us today during sort of hopefully a lunch break when we're all in our lockdown mode, trying to make our way through this fairly challenging period of time at the moment. So look forward to seeing you possibly at our next webinar, and thank you for joining us.